Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Richard Branson. Losing My Virginity, the Autobiography. Chapter 1. 16. The World's Biggest Balloon. 1986, 1987. After the Big Bang, how about a little pop? By 1986, everyone was heading for the city. Everyone who had bought shares in British Telecom had doubled their money. I will never forget going into the city to see the lines of people queuing up to buy Virgin shares. We had already had over 70,000 postal applicants to buy Virgin shares, but these people had left it until the last day, November 13, 1986. I walked up and down the queue thanking people for their confidence, and a number of their replies stuck in my mind. We're not going on holiday this year. We're putting our savings into Virgin. Go on, Richard, prove us right. We're banking on you, Richard. At one point I noticed that the press photographers were taking pictures of my feet. I couldn't understand it. Then I looked down and noticed with a shock that, in the rush to get dressed, I had put on shoes that didn't match. The flotation of Virgin attracted more applications from the public than any other stock market debut issue, apart from the massive government privatizations. Over 100,000 private individuals applied for our shares, and the post office drafted in 20 extra staff to cope with the mail sacks. That day we heard that the Human League had gone to number 1 in America. Beneath our euphoria, we were worried to hear that only a small number of city institutions had applied for shares. It was the first sign of the difficulty we were going to have in our dealings with the city. By 1986, Virgin had become one of Britain's largest private companies, with some 4,000 employees. For the year ended July 1986, Virgin had sales of £189 million, compared with £119 million for the previous year, an increase of around 60%. Our pre-tax profits were £19 million, up from £15 million. Although we were a large company, we had very little flexibility to expand. All we could do was either use up the cash we had earned, or ask our bankers for a bigger overdraft. I watched a number of other private companies sell their shares on the stock market: Body Shop, TSB, Sock Shop, Our Price, Reuters, Atlantic Computers. There was practically a new company every week, and the stock exchange had to set up a queuing system so that, in between the massive privatizations of British Telecom, British Airways and BP, there was an orderly procession. When we arrived back from the Atlantic crossing, the entire country seemed to have enjoyed the challenge. Mrs. Thatcher expressed an interest in seeing the boat, and I offered her a ride up the River Thames. We managed to win approval to break the 5-mile-an-hour speed limit on the Thames, and Tower Bridge opened her gates as Atlantic Challenger came whizzing through. We picked up Mrs. Thatcher, and together with Bob Geldof and Sting, we did a lap of honor up to the Houses of Parliament and back, as other boats on the river blared their horns, and the fire brigade pumped great plumes of water into the air in salute. Mrs. Thatcher, the Iron Lady, stood on the deck beside me and faced into the keen wind. "I must admit," she said, as we accelerated up the river, "I do enjoy going fast. I love powerful boats." I looked across at her. She was indeed enjoying herself. Her profile cut through the wind like a bowsprit, and not a single strand of hair had blown out of place. Although we had raised £30 million from the stock market flotation, I soon began to feel that we had made the wrong decision. A few weeks after our flotation in November, our investment banker at Morgan Grenfell, Roger Seelig, was investigated by the Department of Trade and Industry over his role in Guinness's takeover of distillers, which he had orchestrated in January. Roger resigned from Morgan Grenfell, and, although the case against him was eventually abandoned, his career was ruined. Without being able to use Roger as a touchstone, I began to lose faith in the city and the onerous demands they made of us. Firstly, the city had insisted that Virgin appoint some non-executive directors. Sir Phil Harris was recommended. He was a self-made man who had made a fortune from selling carpets. We also appointed Cobb Stenham, who had been finance director of Unilever and was a well-respected banker. I found it difficult to comply with all the formality the city insisted we adopt. I was used to chatting with Simon and Ken about which bands to sign, and then letting them get on with it. Virgin board meetings had always been highly informal affairs. We met on Duende, or at my house in Oxford Gardens, or while we were on a weekend together. I found our business was not one that could be boxed into a rigid timetable of meetings. We had to make decisions quickly, off the cuff. If we had to wait 4 weeks for the next board meeting before authorizing Simon to sign UB40, then we would probably lose them altogether. I also had a number of disagreements with Don, notably about dividends. I was extremely reluctant to follow British tradition and pay out a large dividend. I preferred the American or Japanese tradition, whereby a company concentrates on reinvesting its profits to build itself and increase share value. To me, a large dividend meant a loss of cash which would be better employed within Virgin than by paying it away. It seemed to me that our outside shareholders had entrusted their money to Virgin in order for us to make it grow, not for us to hand 5% of it back on a plate, which would be taxed as income, and so immediately lose 40% of its value. This may sound like a petty argument, but it illustrates the general loss of control I experienced. Most people think that 50% of a public company is the key to controlling it. While this is true in theory, to a large extent you lose control just by having to appoint non-executive directors and generally giving up your time to satisfy the city. Previously, I had always felt confident about any decision we made, but now Virgin was a publicly quoted company. I began to lose faith in myself. I felt uneasy about making the rapid decisions I have always made, and wondered whether every decision should be formally ratified and minuted at a board meeting. In many ways 1987, our year of being a public company, was Virgin's least creative. We spent at least 50% of our time heading off to the city to explain what we were doing to fund managers, financial advisors, and city PR firms, rather than just getting on and doing it. I also felt very responsible to the people who had invested in Virgin shares. Phil Collins, Mike Oldfield, and Brian Ferry had bought shares. Peter and Carrie's, my neighbors and close friends at Mill End, had invested some of their life savings in Virgin, and my family, my cousins, and many people who had come across me in various walks of life had all bought shares. Trevor Abbott had borrowed £250,000 from me to buy Virgin shares, and although he knew the figures even better than I still felt responsible in case the shares fell in value. I would not have minded if the city analysts had been correct in their assessment that Virgin was doing badly, or that the management was incompetent. What began to infuriate me was that, no matter how often Simon, Ken, or I tried to explain that over 30% of our income came from royalties from the back catalog, and even if we failed to release another record we would still enjoy a stream of earnings, or that 40% of our earnings in France came from French singers rather than Boy George or Phil Collins, giving us a steady local income, the city continually oversimplified how Virgin worked. The analysts still assumed that Virgin was wholly dependent upon me and Boy George. Simon and Ken started taking recordings to the city analysts' meetings and playing them UB40, the Human League and Simple Minds, but they remained unimpressed. Virgin shares, which had started trading at 140 pence, soon slipped down to 120 pence. The faith which the people in the queue had placed in me, and the faith which the Virgin artists and staff placed in me by spending their own money on buying Virgin shares, began to overwhelm me. As 1987 progressed, the Virgin share price recovered to around 140 pence, but never took off. We began to use the money we had raised from the flotation to make two investments. The first was to establish a proper Virgin subsidiary in America. The second was to start stocking Thorn EMI with a view to launching a takeover bid for the company. Virgin Records America Inc. was not a cheap investment. We had learnt the hard way before, and this time we invested heavily. During 1987 we managed to release 4 top 20 singles and 1 gold album in America. Although Virgin America lost us money in 1987, it was a long-term investment, and we felt sure that eventually we would make far more money from having our own record company there than from licensing our best artists to American companies. The second challenge, stocking Thorn EMI, had to be done with care. We felt that the EMI record label was managed in a rather sleepy way, and that their incredible back catalog, which included the Beatles, could be run far more profitably. The Thorn EMI group as a whole was valued at around £750 million, 3 times the size of Virgin. Eventually I thought that the best thing to do was go round and have a chat with Sir Colin Southgate, the managing director of Thorn EMI, and ask him in a friendly way whether he would like to sell us EMI music. "Shall we come along?" Simon and Ken asked. "It might be a bit overbearing," I said. "I'll slip in and see him face to face, and then if he's keen we can all meet him." I called Sir Colin and arranged a meeting at his office in Manchester Square. I was shown up to the top floor of the office building and ushered into a room. It fell silent. I was confronted by at least 20 unsmiling faces. They lined one side of the table, their pinstriped suits shoulder to shoulder, forming an unbreachable wall. Sir Colin shook my hand and peered over my shoulder to see whether there was anyone else. "It's just me," I said. "Where shall I sit?" One side of the long, gleaming mahogany table was empty. There were 10 or 15 memo pads and sharpened pencils laid out on it. I sat down and looked across at the sea of faces. "Well, let me introduce you," Sir Colin began. He rattled off the names of bankers, lawyers, accountants, and management consultants. "I'm Richard Branson." I introduced myself with a nervous laugh. "And the reason I'm here is that I just wondered whether you would like to. Might like to." I paused. The next opposite all craned towards me. "Might like to sell your EMI subsidiary," I said. "It seems to me that Thorn EMI is such a big group, and that EMI music might not be your top priority. You have so much else going on. That's all." There was a hushed silence. "We're quite happy with EMI," Sir Colin said. "We are taking all steps to run it as a leading member of the Thorn EMI group." "Oh well," I said. "I thought it was worth a try." And with that I stood up and left the room. I went straight round to see Simon and Ken at Vernon Yard. "They're serious," I said. "They're on an emergency footing. They thought I was going to bid for them. They practically had their bayonets fixed. If Sir Colin's so worried that he brought all his heavies along, then they clearly are vulnerable, and I think we should have a crack at them." Simon and Ken agreed with me. Trevor arranged for us to go and see Samuel Montague, another investment bank. Samuel Montague introduced us to Mountly, a property group, and suggested that we could make a joint bid. Since Sir Colin would not sell EMI separately to us, we could bid for the whole group with Mountly, and then split it up. In a nutshell, Mountly would take the national chain of television rental shops, and we would take EMI Music. We knew that our first year's profits as a public company were on course to more than double, at over £30 million, and so we planned to release these results in October at the same time as announcing our bid for Thorn EMI. During the course of the summer, Trevor arranged a £100 million loan with the Bank of Nova Scotia, and we slowly began buying shares in Thorn EMI, paying about £7 a share, as we built up a stake, which we could use as a launch pad for the bid. As the stock market soared higher through the summer months, and some rumors began to circulate that Thorn EMI was vulnerable to a bid, I began to worry that if we left it until October we might be too late. There was not much I could do about it, because I was determined to set off on a challenge which many people thought would be the end of me, a challenge as daunting and as daring as anything in the world of business. Per Lindstrand and I were planning to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in a hot air balloon. Until I returned safe and sound, nobody was going to take the idea of Virgin bidding for Thorn EMI too seriously. It all dated from a telephone call I had received on my first day back at the office after the Atlantic Challenger crossing. "It's someone called Per Lindstrand," Penny said. "He says that he's got an incredible proposal." I picked up the phone. "If you thought that crossing the Atlantic by boat was impressive," said a stilted Swedish voice, "think again. I am planning to build the world's largest hot air balloon, and I'm planning to fly it in the jet stream at 30,000 feet. I believe that it can cross the Atlantic." I had vaguely heard of Per Lindstrand. I knew that he was a world expert at ballooning and held several records, including one for reaching the highest altitude. Per explained to me that nobody had flown a hot air balloon further than 600 miles. And nobody had been able to keep a hot air balloon up in the air for longer than 27 hours. In order to cross the Atlantic, a balloon would have to fly more than 3,000 miles, 5 times further than anyone had ever managed before, and spend 3 times longer up in the air. A balloon filled with helium, like the old Zeppelins, can stay in the air for several days. A hot air balloon relies on the hot air within the envelope rising above the surrounding cold air and taking the balloon with it. But the loss of heat through the balloon's envelope is rapid, and in order to heat the air, balloonists burn propane. Until Per's proposed flight, hot air balloons had been hampered by the impossible weight of fuel needed to keep them afloat. Per thought that we could break the flight record by putting 3 theories into practice. The first one was to take the balloon up to an altitude of around 30,000 feet and fly along in the fast winds, the jet streams, which move along at speeds of up to 200 miles an hour. This had previously been considered impossible, as their power and turbulence could shred any balloon. The second was to use solar power to heat the balloon's air during the day, and thus save fuel. This had never been attempted. The third was that, since the balloon would be flying at 30,000 feet, the pilots would be in a pressurized capsule, rather than the traditional wicker basket. As I studied Per's proposal, I realized with amazement that this vast balloon, a huge ungainly thing which could swallow the Royal Albert Hall without showing a bulge, was actually intended to cross the Atlantic Ocean in far less time than our Atlantic Challenger boat with its 4,000 horsepower engine. Per reckoned on a flying time of under 2 days, with an average speed of 90 knots compared with the boat's speed of just under 40 knots. It would be rather like driving along in the fast lane of the motorway, only to be overtaken by the Royal Albert Hall traveling twice as fast. After wrestling with some of the science and the academic calculations about inertia and wind speeds, I asked Per to come and see me. When we met, I put my hand on the pile of theoretical calculations. "I'll never understand all the science and theory," I said, "but I'll come with you if you answer me this one question." "Of course," Per said, stiffening his back in readiness for some incredibly challenging question. "Do you have any children?" "Yes, I've got 2. "Right then." I stood up and shook his hand. "I'll come. But I'd better learn how to fly one of these things first." It was only later that I learnt that 7 people had already tried to be the first to cross the Atlantic, and that 5 of them had perished. Per took me for a week's crash course on ballooning in Spain. I discovered that ballooning is one of the most exhilarating things I had ever done. The combination of soaring up over the world, the silence when the burners are off, the sensation of floating, and the breathtaking panoramic views all immediately seduced me. After a week of being shouted at by Robin Batchelor, my instructor, who looked like my double, I had my balloon license. I was ready. As the prevailing jet stream flows from west to east, we found a launch site in Maine, close to Boston, about 100 miles inland to avoid the effect of sea breezes. Per reckoned that by the time we crossed the coast we should be up in the jet stream, and above the local weather. Our 2 key mentors were Tom Barrow, who headed the engineering team, and Bob Rice, an expert meteorologist. Both men were clearly such authorities that I unreservedly put my trust in them. The jet stream parts over the Atlantic, with one branch heading up to the Arctic, and another branch swerving down to the Azores, and back out to the middle of the ocean. Bob Rice told us that getting our route right was like rolling a ball bearing between 2 magnets. In the event of running out of fuel or icing up, we would have to ditch the balloon at sea. "There are flotation collars round the capsule which will keep it buoyant," Tom Barrow said. "What if they don't work?" I asked. "You'll get your money back," he said. "Or rather, we'll get the money back on your behalf." At our final briefing with Tom at Sugarloaf Mountain, Maine, the day before the balloon went up, he went through the last emergency drills. "Landing this thing is going to be like freewheeling a Sherman tank without any brakes. It's going to be a crash." His last warning was the most telling. Now, even though we're here, I can still abort this project if I think it's too dangerous, or if you develop health problems. "Does that include mental health problems?" I joked. "No," Tom said. "That's a prerequisite for doing this flight. If you're not completely nuts and scared to death, then you shouldn't be on board in the first place." I was certainly scared to death.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.